This is our Empowering LGBTQ plus youth through banned books, allyship, and solidarity. This is in collaboration with the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Community Centre in New York City. This presentation is by Richard Perkins and Gemma Chiarello-Lynch. Thank you. So part of this project, we asked ourselves as social workers, what can we do to help queer youth with coping and fostering resilience and being able to listen to their problems being faced by this population helps us to educate ourselves and put us in a position to better help queer youth and queer individuals. We can also look at becoming allies to support and advocate for the queer community. In a one-on-one basis, remind clients of strengths so they understand that they do have power to push back against things like stigmatization, to remind them they deserve access to mental health, physical health, and treatment just like everybody else does. We can learn more about state laws on queer rights, and not just ones currently in place, but those that are being proposed, so that we can stand up and advocate for clients and for the queer community. And not only that, but expressing our views about these laws, we can reach out to state representatives, members of Congress, and identify specific ways to be more safe and inclusive for queer youth. We can also help teach clients on a one-on-one or on a group basis how to foster resilience, promote understanding, and just achieving change for queer youth. And obviously, as we mentioned in the first slide, we fully outlined how we plan to go about that.
As you can see here, this entails, as Gemma noted, a book fair, distribution of free books to attendees, including queer youth, families, and allies, with a focus on queer and trans-affirming literature for all ages. We're also looking at a drag queen story hour. There has already been one hosted by area legislators, including a representative for Chelsea and Hell's Kitchen, and a local drag queen named Miss Candy Samples, who's heavily involved with HIV, substance use advocacy for housing works, as well as programs with the LGBT Center. Plenary speakers, storytelling exercises, as well as live music and refreshments. Now, how do we harness the strength of banned books, right? And here's a couple of banned books that are frequently a target. The image here is actually from the LGBT Center's bookstore. So you have extreme or extremist groups like Moms of Liberty who are increasing their attacks on LGBTQ youth, right, by engaging in vast book bans, specifically books targeting queer identities under the guise of removing obscenity, but with the real purpose of erasing queer experiences from schools, right? O'Loughlin et al. Point out how banned books can serve as a powerful tool in addressing and dispelling anti-LGBTQ stigma, right? Especially the stigma that queer identities equate to sexual perversions or obscenity unworthy of recognition or support in a school setting, right? These books challenge the harmful narratives perpetuated by such bans, right? The authors further stress that while queer books are not the overtly stated targets of book bans, in most cases, it really is only queer books that are targeted, right? As somehow overtly sexual. Other books are not targeted if they perpetuate heteronormative ideals. Educators, even in states where there are not yet book bans, are now afraid of sharing banned books with students. So LGBTQ students are left without support or validation of their own identities, right? And this project aims to overcome this barrier, right, by making banned books available to all children and youth, and to foster allyship, strengthen this resilience, and resist stigma, right? Two of the books that are frequently, this is all about empowering LGBTQ youth, right? And two of the books that have been impactful that address LGBTQ issues are Lawn Boy by Jonathan Evison. It's one of the American Library Association's top 10 most banned books for the past 2 years, right? And it's about a young gay man of color chasing the elusive American dream. And then there's another book called An ABC of Equality by Chana Janelle Ewing, a young children's book that uses engaging artwork to teach children about concepts of equity and social justice. Both of these books are obscene by the detractors' definition solely because they deal with social justice issues around queer identity and queer justice. Offering these books to children and teens who might not otherwise have access to them can have a meaningful impact on their own identity development, perceived safety, and mental health. And they go a long way in combating anti-LGBTQ stigma by normalizing and uplifting queer voices. Now discussing stigma and mental health for LGBTQ youth. Stigma has a detrimental effect on the health and well-being of those who are victimized, including negatively influencing mental health, contributing to poor self-perceptions, and increasing feelings of guilt, belittlement, and shame, right? LGBTQIA communities and stigmatization are addressed. Those who identify within these communities are among the most vulnerable, right? And the most stigmatized minority groups in society, with a long documented history of stigmatization and victimization. And then as a result of this stigma, many individuals report experiences of bullying, right? Being made to feel ashamed and being fearful of coming out, i.e. disclosing sexuality to friends, family, etc. And then individuals living in states with legal protections experienced far less stigma in their communities, far less anxiety and victimization, and they were less likely to have attempted suicide, right? Stigmatism can lead to much stress in the LGBTQ community. Minority stress, we've talked about this. And then there's also intersecting minorities stress, if you're a member of the LGBTQ population, but you're also devoutly religious. You could become further marginalized by your own protective religious community. Same goes for certain ethnic and racial communities. You could be ostracized and marginalized from all of your protective communities.
So if you look at stigma and how it contributes to social inequality and marginalization, we just need to take a look at anti-queer policies and laws, and banned books are just one of many being passed by Congress to further silence the community. Various states have already removed many vitally important queer books, queer content. They've silenced queer authors, and this is quickly picking up speed following things like Florida's Don't Say Gay bill, anti-trans bathroom bills. Just a growing rate of homophobia in the US is heavily evident in the policies and laws being passed at the moment. By refusing certain books to queer youth, they're being denied the right to educate themselves and feel connected fully to who they are, or being forced to hide who they are. Recognizing themselves in things like literature is vitally important to allowing them to grow up with a greater sense of self. When they're denied basic access to education about who they are, it has a detrimental effect on their mental health. And it not only encourages a negative sense of self, but also contributes to the forming of core beliefs and values that do not truly align with who they are, which can then lead to things like internalized homophobia if they don't see themselves fully represented. It can make them question whether or not they matter, or if who they are at their core is something they should be ashamed of or something they should hide. I feel a more supportive legal landscape would likely reduce things like economic instability and health disparities that queer youth currently face. There are social prejudices and misconceptions about queer individuals, nature, moral character, and this can be seen across political campaigns, parliamentary debates, things like public demonstrations. And the rise of this ultra-conservative and ultra-nationalist groups also threatens minorities and prevents the development of legislation and policies that are inclusive to queer individuals. And I think we see, particularly during periods of political instability, that queer issues are often framed by political or religious leaders as a threat to this national cohesion, culture, and tradition that the US has this belief of. People who identify as LGBT become the other or foreign, whose sole purpose is to undermine the national project from within. And in addition to all of those factors, they negatively affect queer individuals' access to things like healthcare, education, housing, employment, even political participation, and their personal security. Students who are queer face things like physical violence, social isolation, humiliation, and death threats at school, which can result in feelings of unsafety, missed days from school, lower academic achievement as a result. The abuse that queer youth experience in educational settings makes them much more likely to commit suicide than heterosexual youth. Queer people are also discriminated against in workplace environments throughout the entire employment cycle, which leads them to conceal their sexual orientation and gender identity, which again results in considerable anxiety and a loss of productivity. It is all too common, unfortunately, for health services to be unavailable, inaccessible, or unacceptable due to barriers such as the criminalization of consensual same-sex activities. Healthcare providers often discriminate against queer people, and their medical privacy is violated or disrespected, which discourages them from seeking treatment moving forward.
Yeah, and then further on to the subject of stigma, how it manifests in society. You have risk of abuse and neglect of LGBTQ youth, right? Studies show, we have decreased educational outcomes for LGBTQ youth. Studies also show societal anti-gay sentiment and internalized stigma increase, right? And there's unintended broader societal consequences. There have been noted teacher shortages, for instance, in Florida, where they passed Don't Say Gay laws. Teachers are leaving en masse. Lack of textbook for schools, again, coming out of Florida. Something as innocuous as a math textbook has been turned down because of certain anti-quote-unquote woke or anti-queer policies. Even the mere recognition of any form of queerness or non-traditional sexual expression is viewed as somehow obscene. And so you're finding a certain shortage of textbooks and educational materials in states that have anti-LGBTQ laws. There are some strategies that we can usually employ as social workers to help LGBTQ teens cope with and resist stigma, right? Such as creating a sense of solidarity and support within schools and community. And studies show that adaptive coping, with the stigma often results in stress-related growth, right? And is associated with better emotional regulation and better mental health outcomes, right? We want to be able to target emotional regulation in coping with stress that could have significant health benefits, right? Such as identity management, for instance. We also want to have very robust support systems, right? First of all, through identity management and their efforts to manage stigma, social workers can use diverse identity strategies, right? Such as trying to influence the boundary between insiders, and that's people who are stigmatized, queer youth, and outsiders, those who are not, right? To reduce exposure to stigmatizing audiences, to protect themselves and enable social support, So that identity management and social support goes hand in hand. We want to reframe the stigma in a more positive light, right? Hopefully to negate it, right? And to bring these identities to light, familiarize the outsiders, right? And to gain increased attention and social acceptance and social validation from preferred audiences, and to decrease overall disapproval and hostility from others, right? And, through banned books and community solidarity, we're putting forth these positive messages. Resisting stigma is going to be super empowering, but it's not for everybody, right? As it can be super exhausting. Just even in the work I do on a day-to-day basis, and resisting anti-queer and anti-drug user stigma, for instance, it's nonstop, almost thankless work, and we require social support to be effective, which not many LGBTQ people have access to. Most research on stigma adheres to the coping model, which is a bit pathological and also focuses on avoiding negative consequences rather than creating positive ones, right? And we want to move beyond just coping through promotion of queer identity and starting from the get-go, promoting banned books, community solidarity, right? Also, long-term coping can just become super draining, right? I actually had a friend once tell me, this is a Black female, lesbian identified, who stated, I'm all for resilience, but I am tired of being resilient. I want to celebrate who I am, not defend who I am. And that's sort of what our goal is with this. Successful individual coping can really sometimes sacrifice collective efforts, because individuals can evade, the negative effects of stigma with individual level behaviors without addressing the overall conditions that create stigma. So our banned book, and community solidarity approach really supports LGBTQ youth. And we're going to move beyond individual coping and individual resistance to community, right, and allyship resistance. The key is to change the circumstances that create stigma on the first level, through collective efforts, right, led by social workers, and that includes, uplifting LGBTQ youth in this way, and challenging the systems that oppress them. This whole banned book event is only one tiny, tiny, small event, that pushes us in the direction towards this goal, and also in a very limited space in New York City. This is something that we would love to replicate in town after town, city after city, to show these youth that we validate them, that we support them, and we want to see them survive and thrive, right? And then, finish this off. Call to action. uniting for a stigma-free future with social worker support, coping and fostering resilience, and beyond. How can we as social workers help? And an alternative model is to think of the stigmatized not as passive targets of prejudice, who focus only on avoiding negative outcomes by coping and becoming resilient, right? But as active participants in society, and even in broader society, who seek to understand their social world and to create positive outcomes. This more empowering way of thinking about stigmatization enables the stigmatized to engage in efforts aimed at resisting and removing stigma at the collective level, and beyond that, also in setting up systems where the stigma isn't present, right? Stigmatized groups can actively use available resources to resist the stigmatizing tendencies of the more powerful group, the dominant cis heteronormative group, to the extent that they do. So it's inappropriate to portray people as passive recipients of stigma when we as social workers can empower them to become active in destigmatization. Some forms of stigmatization are extraordinarily pervasive, right, and really, really embedded in daily life. So it's going to be tricky to get over, right? And developing resilience and resisting stigmatization as a supportive process rather than as a binary exclusionary concept can help in overcoming stigmatization. This is all about the systems and the environments in which we work. And sure, we could tackle individual level stigmatization and coping skills, but we really need to attack it on all levels, micro, meso, macro, if we want to affect the change necessary to reduce and maybe even eliminate stigma, right? And in response to these anti-LGBTQ policies, people are also coping by confronting their internalized homophobia, and this is a big one. We as queer people often internalize the messages we receive about us in terms of being lesser than the cis heteronormative patriarchy, being somehow seen as over sexualized or obscene or counter to goodness. And this, overcoming these embedded feelings. I grew up in the South as a gay teen, and I just thought everything was wrong with me because of my sexuality. So overcoming this absolutely facilitates resilience and decreases identity-based shame. But I would not have been able to get over or past the shame had it not been for the interventions of social workers, of therapists, of community allies, of organizations like the LGBTQ Center. This resilience is also manifested through self-affirmation that helps protect against negative impacts of these policies. And the self-affirmation can be supported through literature, through shared art, through shared community, through shared books, making these internal coping strategies a little more robust by having other external supports that help promote and challenge some of these anti-LGBTQ messages, right? Especially now, that these messages are being perpetuated and repeated ad nauseum through certain political administrations and media outlets. So we want to affect an increase in positive sense of self. And these sort of actions have historically shown, as Gonzalez et al. Point out, including strong allyship and bringing in marginalized people. These often function as a source of support and facilitate hope, empowerment, and resilience in a way that can then allow people to continue to foster that resilience among their own communities. People who engage in activism advocacy efforts, especially queer people who do so, also feel an increased sense of hopefulness and are subsequently inspired to engage in political advocacy, right? So this is, again, where we come in. Just by introducing queer youth to the power of collective action and collective work, hopefully can inspire them to join the cause and advocate not just for themselves and for their communities, but for equity and anti-oppression overall. And access to LGBTQ communities, right, is crucial for facilitating resilience through exposure to other queer people. This community can function as a source of protection to reduce feelings of vulnerability during oppressive socio-political times, while also helping other members of the community feel supported. And so how can social workers do this? How can we support coping? We listen to the problems being faced by the population, right? We become an ally. We support and we advocate. We remind clients of their strengths, and we use a strength-based work, right, in one-to-one contact with clients to encourage and improve upon resilience. We learn more about our state-specific laws on LGBTQ rights and those being proposed. We express our views about these laws by reaching out to state representatives or members of Congress, and we identify specific ways that we can work on being more safe, being more inclusive, and being more equitable for LGBTQ youth. And with that, here is our references page. And then some image references. And it's worth noting that all of the imagery used in this presentation came directly from the LGBTQ Center down on 13th Street in Greenwich Village / Chelsea, all photographed by T. Fleming, sort of the staff photographer for the LGBTQ Center. And all the images shown were also reflective of the bookstore, the youth group that's on site, as well as the library. Thank you so much.